The time is just gone 8:38 a.m. on this Friday morning, and this is the Juma edition of News and Views. And we are now going across to Mariam Jooma Çarikçi, independent researcher, and against the background of we know the United Nations. World leaders gathering at the United Nations and utilizing the opportunity to meet with Donald Trump. Now, Recep Erdogan met with Donald Trump, and we have learned that apparently he walked away with a prize after skipping the less hospitable Joe Biden for years in Washington. And to unpack all of this and to understand the ties between the renewed ties between Turkey and the United States of America. Mariam Juma, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Juma Mubarak to you and welcome.
Walaikum salam, Uncle Inayat. Juma Mubarak, and thank you for having me.
Yes, Mariam, this is quite an interesting development as far as the United States and Turkey is concerned, signing an agreement talking about cooperation on strategic civil nuclear energy development. And also, we heard about Donald Trump talking about a major announcement after meeting with his Turkish counterpart.
Definitely. So, what Ankara has come away from the White House with is definitely something more than photos. The Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar said that it has restarted, the process towards strategic civil nuclear cooperation. What's important here to understand is that it's basically activating what was already agreed upon in 2008, what's called the 123 agreement. So actually, when I saw the headlines, I assumed that this is fake news because this has already been in the process for a while. However, what it does now is it gives it momentum, and it's particularly important, Uncle Inait, if you look at the timing. So while the details on the actual agreement are sparse, it's the optics and the timing that are significant. And why I say that is because Turkey is actually uh, almost about ready to start up its first reactor, which is completely Russian built, called the Akkuyu plant. And that was built and owned, actually, it's owned by Rosatom, the Russian Atomic Agency. So the fact that Turkey's already got a deal that's close to completion with Russia, and now signing or at least activating an agreement with the U.S. means that the Turkish multi-vector or multilateral position of foreign policy is certainly being demonstrated.
Mariam, with the focus on nuclear, and we know that a memorandum of understanding was signed on strategic civil nuclear cooperation between the countries, and also the fact that we know what had happened a few months ago with regard to Iran as well, where their nuclear power capabilities came under severe of a threat as well. And just looking at why this is so important, because one of the most critical issues, and I know you'd like to discuss this, is the fact that Turkey actually holds the nuclear warheads at its base in Turkey.
Right. So we need to understand, what exactly was signed and why now, as I mentioned earlier. So the strategic civil, remember, this is a civil nuclear cooperation, right? So what it means is it's a political commitment for the two countries to explore technology, investment, and energy security projects, right? So what that means is U.S. firms will be able to pitch, for building large reactors, and especially for the fuel services. What it does is it reduces Ankara's dependence on Rosatom. I didn't mention that Rosatom is fully not just built by Russia, but it also is operated, and is the revenue that comes out of Rosatom's Akkuyu plant in Turkey goes back to Russia. So essentially, what Turkey has to do is buy at a fixed rate, 15 years for 15 years, a fixed rate of energy from Russia, which it then passes on to Turkish consumers. But Russia basically keeps the revenue, it keeps the ownership of the plant, and it keeps its operating systems, which means that Turkey is locked into a dependence on Russia at this particular plant. So, what the US agreement or the MOU does, it basically offers an alternative. And with that, there's a lot more leverage in terms of ownership because of Turkey having, being a NATO partner and also hosting the nuclear warheads. So when we say hosting, we that's what it is. It literally is just hosting the atomic warheads without having any access to them necessarily. But it also assumes that Turkey has leverage over the US. So it's a push and pull kind of scenario where Turkey uses whatever it can to leverage concessions out of the US, and at the same time also being a deterrent to other powers in the region, for example, Iran.
But also, Mariam, I think just to understand the broader global consequences, particularly with regard to the United States and Russia and the relationship between Turkey and the United States, the relationship between Turkey and Russia, is this likely to impact in terms of the geopolitics or the political dynamics between these three countries?
Look, I think what Erdogan is trying to demonstrate, and which has actually been a central part of Turkey's foreign policy since 2002, when the AKP party took, received the dominant vote in Turkey, is a multilateral platform for balancing its relations between East and West. Remember, previous to the Erdogan government, the CHP, which was a Republican party, had very, very strong ties to West, and it was seen as very pro-secular, almost anti-Islamic. And so, what Erdogan is trying to do, using the multilateral platforms of either its EU membership bid or its NATO membership, and its historical relationship with the US, is to balance its dependence. It's basically to what you do in financial risk planning is to share the risk, right? So across, so you're not dependent on one particular investment. And as I've said, the Russian partnership is not necessarily a full partnership. It actually gives leverage to Russia. Now, to counteract that, Turkey's answer to that is also that Turkey is a transit point for Russian oil. So on the one hand, Russia has got Turkey locked into a nuclear servicing deal. But on the other hand, Turkey is a strategic geographical transit point for Russian oil to the EU. So what I'm seeing here, or what many analysts are seeing, is a very clear attempt by Turkey to balance its interests between East and West, simply because it's realized over the many years, and especially now with what's happened in Qatar, with the US strikes on Qatar, is that you can't trust any single ally. And I would go far as to suggest that Erdogan is fully aware of Trump's fickle nature. So he's not, even though he's gotten all this praise from Trump, he understands that the man can change his mind in a matter of seconds. So it's also about leveraging what he can across the board. Remember that China also is negotiating with Ankara to build a plant in northwest Turkey. And then you also have a Japanese and French consortium that actually had planned a second plant in northeast Turkey. So we're looking at, as I said, a multilateral, multi-vector form of energy policy.
Yes, Mariam, but also I think let's just look at the other implications, and in terms of trying to define what this actually means for Turkey, particularly with regards to the Arab nations. We're looking at Qatar. We talk about the security architecture that is being redefined, and how does this all actually fit into a broader picture? And just to make sure that as far as Turkey is concerned, its relationship with the Arab nations in the Middle East, but also consequences or implications as far as Israel is concerned and its nuclear capability.
Right. So Turkey and Qatar have had a defense pact since 2014, and Turkey has actually kept a permanent military presence in Qatar. And so there again, you see Qatar hosting the US, but they also have Turkish troops. And it might not contradict itself because of the NATO alliance between Turkey and the US, but certainly in terms of the ideological orientation, there's quite a deep split. So Turkey's troops have increased in the Gulf, since the Gulf crisis. And then since 2017, there's been a very significant uptake in the level of strategic relationship between Turkey and the Qatari command. So there's a couple of thousand personnel actually, and increasing naval cooperation. And the naval part is very important because it allows Doha to project power beyond just the Gulf. And it also allows for, as we've suggested before, a balanced architecture. So it diversifies Qatar's security partners. So what this means in terms of Israel is that it's producing a deterrent effect, or it should produce at least an increased deterrent effect, because as you've seen, the US is becoming far more, I think, hesitant about putting boots on the ground. The US are not interested in actual engagement in the Middle East as it used to be in the 90s and early 2000s. We're seeing a very different track. And so Qatar is now also, I think, under with the understanding of its severe breach of trust between the US, that it needs to also look beyond its borders, beyond its traditional allies for security protection.
Yes. Also, I think what is absolutely important, and I think you alluded to it earlier on as well, how unpredictable someone like Donald Trump can actually be in terms of negotiations, because he says one thing today, he does something else tomorrow, and we've seen this throughout the second term of office. Since he's taken office, the turnaround and the about turn on the part of Donald Trump, and not only with Turkey, but many of the leaders across the entire world. So, I know Turkey obviously looking for stability. The economy obviously needs a boost as well. And would Donald Trump, by reaching out now to Turkey, is he wary of the fact of the strong relationship between Russia? You mentioned China as well, because one cannot exclude China from the equation when we look at Turkey, its foreign policy, and its relationship with the rest of the world.
100%, Uncle Inayat, you've hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the economy, because that, as we know, lies at the heart of most of global politics. In the end, comes down to who benefits and for how long. And interestingly, I think Donald Trump is probably one of the most fickle of world leaders. If you think about the fact that he basically withdrew from Syria via tweet in 2018, I don't know if you remember, in December, when he basically said that the ISIS have been defeated, or via tweet, and that the US would now pull out of Syria, without informing his allies, even his own advisors. So I don't think anyone or any ally would basically, put their full trust in what Trump has to say. Considering the fact that he gave Zelensky a dressing down, and now all of a sudden he's confident that the Ukraine can actually win the war again. So what I think the Middle East needs to, and is perhaps moving in that direction more and more, is to understand the benefit of multilateral and multi-vector politics. You see, we've moved far from the Cold War era. That kind of thinking is actually what kept the Biden administration, so averse to engaging with Turkey. It had this idea of, um, the world is divided into two spheres basically, and that because of Turkey's Islamic orientation, it falls under, the enemy. But Trump is different in the sense that we've heard many times before. He's a businessman, and he's trying to see where he can benefit the most. And so, if the U.S. are going to be servicing, the development of nuclear energy, he would certainly, try to get the maximum out of that. But what it does again, as we say, is it highlights the fact that none of the Middle Eastern countries are independent to the extent that they can isolate any of the superpowers. So when we speak about why has Turkey not done anything about the genocide, remember that it doesn't have, while it might have leverage in certain areas, it doesn't have the full capability of going into a full-scale war where Western allies would most definitely support Israel. So there is this need to build regional consensus, to build the regional security architecture, which unfortunately means that Gaza's the justice for Gaza is delayed.
Well, Mariam, we're going to have to leave it at that. As always, Jazakallah for your time, but these are developments that we will be watching with interest, and I'm sure you as well. So at some point in time, we will see some of the outcomes are and what the consequences of this agreement translates to. So, but for now, Jazakallah for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Mariam Jooma Çarikçi, independent researcher, with us this morning. Was that we're going for a break. Next up, Juma Inspirations, Maulana Ibrahim Musa.